The train pulled away with a metallic cry that echoed through the wide, empty plains, leaving behind a single plume of smoke drifting into the autumn sky. The depot sat lonely on the edge of the frontier town of Dry Creek, no more than a wooden platform, a telegraph shack, and a water tower groaning under its own rust. And there she was, Eliza Harrow, alone, abandoned, and clutching a battered carpet bag to her chest. Her dress was simple, the sort a mail-order bride might wear when meeting a husband she had never seen, and her eyes, though red from weeping, held the stubborn spark of survival. The passengers had all gone, their wagons rattling down dusty streets, their families waiting in town. Eliza had no family waiting. She had been promised marriage to a rancher who never showed. The townsfolk gave her a passing glance, some pitying, others suspicious. Out here, women who arrived without a man beside them were viewed with wary eyes. Whispers carried on the wind, left at the depot, deserted like a stray dog. From across the street came the sound of spurs. A tall figure moved with unhurried steps, his shadow stretching long in the fading light. He wore a dust-stained hat, the brim pulled low, a weathered coat, and the kind of boots that had seen more miles than most men ever walked. His name was Jackson Hale, though in town most called him simply the cowboy. He was known less for words and more for the silence that followed him, silence broken only when his revolver spoke louder than law. He stopped at the platform and studied her with eyes the color of old whiskey. She tried to look away, ashamed, but there was no mistaking the way his presence steadied the air around her. "Your man didn't come," he said at last, his voice low, rough, but not unkind. Her throat tightened. "He was supposed to meet me. He wrote letters. He sent for me." The cowboy's gaze lingered on her torn gloves, her trembling hands. He had seen it before. Women promised a new life, tricked or betrayed, left stranded in towns where mercy was in short supply. The frontier was no place for the unprotected. Without another word, he reached into his coat, pulled out a few silver dollars, and walked to the ticket clerk. The man behind the window, half asleep, sat up straight when the coins hit the counter. "Buy your fare back east," the cowboy ordered. But then he paused, looking over his shoulder at her proud posture despite the quiver in her lip, at the defiance in her tear-streaked face. "No," he said, quieter this time, as if speaking to himself. "Her journey don't end back east." He returned, placed the ticket stub into her palm, then gently closed her fingers around it. His hand was calloused, strong, yet unexpectedly careful. "Your journey ends with me." The words struck her like a church bell ringing across the prairie, deep and unshakable. She did not know this man, yet something inside her stirred. Fear, yes, but also the faintest flicker of hope. The wide frontier, the days that followed, tested every ounce of Eliza's strength. Jackson Hale did not explain much, nor did he ask permission. He brought her to his horse, a rangy bay gelding named Copper, and lifted her into the saddle as though she weighed nothing at all. The town gossips muttered that she had already been claimed, that her fate was sealed the moment the cowboy laid eyes on her. But Eliza was no man's possession. She sat stiffly in the saddle, clutching her bag, glaring at his broad back as they rode beyond the town limits into the sea of rolling grass. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, though her voice trembled. "To the ranch," he replied simply. "I never agreed to this. You didn't need to. Out here being alone's a death sentence. You'll see soon enough." She wanted to argue, to rail against the injustice, but as the miles passed, the vast emptiness swallowed her words. The land stretched in every direction, burnt gold under the sun, scattered with sagebrush cut with dry creek beds. Hawks circled above, and in the far distance mountains rose like jagged teeth. That first night they camped under the stars. Jackson built the fire, brewed coffee thick as tar, and gave her a blanket. She sat across from him, every nerve alert, afraid of what he might do. Yet he only sipped his coffee, staring into the flames as if wrestling with ghosts. Finally he spoke. "Men like the one who left you behind, they don't last long out here. Words are cheap. Bullets ain't." She hugged the blanket tighter. "And you? What are you, Mr. Hale?" He looked at her, the firelight carving lines of sorrow across his face, a man trying to outlive his sins. Whispers of the past Eliza soon learned that Jackson Hale carried a past heavy as saddle iron. In Dry Creek, rumors followed him like dust on the wind. Some said he'd once ridden with outlaws, that he had blood on his hands from raids along the Rio Grande. Others claimed he had been a lawman who shot one too many men, crossing a line even the badge couldn't protect. Whatever the truth, she saw in him a kind of wounded honor. He rose early, worked hard, and spoke little. When danger pressed close, whether a rattlesnake in the brush or a pair of drunken cowhands spoiling for trouble, his hand hovered near his holster, steady as stone. For Eliza, every day was a test. She had come west dreaming of marriage, of a home, of a fresh start. Instead, she found herself bound to a man she barely knew, a man who carried justice and violence in equal measure. And yet, there were moments. Moments when his eyes softened, when he handed her wildflowers gathered from the prairie without a word, when he spoke of the land with reverence, as though it were the only truth he trusted. Her heart, broken and betrayed at the depot, began to stir again. The first storm, their fragile bond was tested by the land itself. One evening, a storm rolled over the horizon, black as coal lit by veins of lightning. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, and hailstones pelted the earth. Jackson shouted for her to ride faster, guiding Copper and her along a narrow canyon toward shelter. The thunder crashed, and in that chaos, she glimpsed the true measure of him. Not just the gunslinger, not just the outlaw or savior, but a man determined to protect her at all costs. When they finally reached the cave, soaked and shivering, he wrapped his coat around her shoulders, his arms a fortress against the storm. "You'll be safe," he murmured. Though his own body shook from cold, she pressed against him, torn between gratitude and fear. And for the first time since stepping off the train, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps she had not been abandoned to ruin after all. The storm passed, but the greater storms lay ahead. In the coming days, Eliza would discover that Jackson Hale was hunted, by men who wanted his blood, by memories that would not let him rest, and by the cruel law of the West that spared no one. She had thought her greatest trial was being left alone at the depot. She was wrong. The true journey had only just begun. The morning after the storm broke, the land smelled of wet earth and wild sage. Puddles reflected the rising sun, and the prairie grasses bent under the weight of water, glistening like fields of glass. Eliza woke curled in Jackson Hale's coat, the warmth of his body lingering though he had already risen. She blinked against the light, disoriented, still shaken from the thunder and fear. He stood at the mouth of the cave, his silhouette outlined in pale gold, scanning the horizon with that same stillness she was beginning to recognize in him, the stillness of a predator waiting, or of a man always expecting danger. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, as though even the dawn itself might try to draw on him. She pulled the coat tighter, rising slowly. "You never sleep, do you?" His gaze flicked toward her, then back to the land. "Sleep's a luxury. Out here you take it when it comes." She wanted to ask what hunted him so relentlessly, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she busied herself with the small tasks of morning, shaking out the blanket, smoothing her hair, trying to preserve some shred of dignity. Yet no matter how she tried, she could not erase the truth. She was at the mercy of a stranger, bound to him by circumstance and his choice alone. When he finally turned back, there was something in his eyes, an unspoken apology, or perhaps a warning. "We've got to ride," he said. "Storm washed out the low trails. Men'll be moving in the open now. If they're after me, they'll be faster than usual." Her chest tightened. "Men? What men?" He hesitated only a moment, but it was enough. She caught the flicker of shadow across his face, the kind that spoke of debts unpaid and enemies not yet buried. "Outlaws," he admitted. "Maybe bounty hunters. Depends who's chasing this week." The words hit like another thunderclap. She had followed him into the wilderness, and now she learned she might be riding at the side of a marked man. The ranch at Red Mesa. After 2 more days of hard travel, they came to his ranch. It was no grand estate, just a small spread tucked against the foot of Red Mesa, the earth rising in sheer cliffs that caught the evening light like fire. A corral held 3 lean horses. A cabin, rough-hewn but sturdy, stood with its chimney smoking faintly. Beyond, the land stretched wild and untamed, framed by jagged peaks and canyons. Eliza's heart swelled despite her fear. This place, though harsh, was beautiful. It whispered of freedom, of a chance to build something new away from the rules and cruelties of Eastern society. Yet it was also isolated, exposed, vulnerable. Inside the cabin, she found a single room with a stone hearth, a narrow bed, a table, and shelves lined with tools, bullets, and a few worn books. It was not a home prepared for a wife. It was a fortress for a man who lived on the edge. Jackson set down supplies, stoked the fire, and without looking at her said, This is where you'll stay. You'll be safe here. Her voice shook as she answered. Safe? You just told me men are hunting you. They're hunting me, he corrected. Not you. Long as you're under this roof, I'll see to it they don't touch you. She studied him in silence, torn between terror and a strange, unwanted gratitude. He was no gentleman. He was no husband. But he was a man who built walls with his own hands, who carried the weight of danger so she wouldn't have to. Whispers in the canyon. That night, the wind howled down the canyon, rattling the shutters. Eliza lay awake on the narrow bed. Every creak of the cabin boards a threat in her mind. Across the room, Jackson sat cleaning his revolver, the firelight glinting on steel. Tell me the truth, she whispered at last. Were you ever really an outlaw? He didn't look up, but his hand stilled on the barrel. Truth is, Miss Harrow, out here there ain't much difference between lawman and outlaw. One side pays you to shoot, the other pays you to stop shooting. Either way, bloodstain's the same. The bitterness in his tone chilled her. She wanted to believe he was good, that fate had bound her to a protector, not a villain, but the frontier cared little for what a woman wanted. Before she could press further, a sound split the night, a horse's distant whinny, then the faint jangle of spurs carried on the wind. Jackson rose at once, holstering his revolver, every muscle coiled. Stay inside, he ordered. Her breath caught. Who is it? Trouble. Men of dust and hunger. Through the crack in the shutter, Eliza saw them. 3 riders emerging from the canyon, their silhouettes dark against the moonlit cliffs. They carried rifles slung across their backs, and their laughter carried, coarse and cruel. One called out, voice dripping with mockery. Hail. Heard you took in a little bird from the depot. Thought you swore off rescuing strays. Jackson stepped onto the porch, his stance calm but unyielding. You rode a long way to yap like coyotes. What do you want? Same as always, the man sneered. Your head, your horse, and whatever else you've been hiding. His gaze slid toward the cabin. Maybe the girl, too. Eliza's blood ran cold. She clutched the blanket to her chest, praying Jackson would send them away, praying his gun would not fail. Jackson's voice cut through the night like steel on stone. She ain't yours to speak of. Ride on, or you'll choke on your own words. The standoff stretched, the kind where a single twitch could decide who lived and who bled. Eliza held her breath, her heart hammering so loud she thought the men must hear it. And then, sudden as lightning, the outlaws spurred forward, hands reaching for their rifles. Jackson's revolver cleared leather faster than thought. The crack of gunfire split the night, sparks flashing in the darkness. One rider screamed, falling from his saddle. The others scattered, cursing, firing blindly into the shadows. Eliza pressed her face to the floor, trembling, praying, while the storm of violence raged outside. The blood in the dirt. When silence fell again, she dared to lift her head. Jackson stood in the doorway, chest heaving, revolver smoking. The body of a man lay twisted in the dirt, his blood soaking into the thirsty ground. The other 2 had fled, their hoofbeats fading into the canyon. Jackson turned back inside, his face grim, eyes hollow. For the first time, Eliza saw not just the strength in him, but the cost, the toll of every life taken, every night spent waiting for vengeance to find him. You asked if I was an outlaw, he said hoarsely. There's your answer. Tears stung her eyes. She wanted to recoil, to hate him for the blood on his hands, but she also wanted to reach out, to touch the weary soul behind those eyes, to tell him he was not alone. And in that terrible moment, she realized the truth. Her journey did not end at the depot. It began here, in this cabin at the edge of the world, beside a man haunted by death yet fighting to protect her. And whether she liked it or not, she was bound to him now. The dead man at Red Mesa was only the beginning. In the days ahead, the blood he spilled would draw others. Men more ruthless, men who carried old grudges and hungers that would not be denied. And Eliza Harrow would have to decide whether to flee back east, or to stand beside the cowboy who claimed her journey ended with him. The days after the shooting stretched heavy with silence. The body had been buried beneath the Red Mesa, a cairn of stones marking the grave, though neither Eliza nor Jackson spoke prayers over it. In the West, graves often stood unblessed, for there were too many dead and too few preachers to sanctify the dirt. But the silence carried more than grief. It carried the weight of choices made, the kind that left no path back to innocence. Eliza felt it every time she glanced at the stones piled outside the canyon. She had not pulled the trigger, but she had been part of it. a witness to blood spilled in her name, and though Jackson said nothing, she could feel the gravity in his shoulders, the way he moved slower, his eyes darker, as if another ghost had been added to the chain he already dragged behind him. Yet even in the heaviness, life on the ranch pressed forward. The horses still needed tending. The roof still leaked when the rains came, and the fire still had to be stoked each morning. Jackson went about these tasks with a quiet efficiency, while Eliza, unaccustomed to frontier labor, stumbled her way into usefulness. She learned how to gather kindling, how to patch worn shirts with trembling stitches, how to cook beans and salt pork over a crackling fire without burning them to cinders. And Jackson, though he never asked for it, accepted her help. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, their eyes would meet across the cabin. There was no smile in his gaze, but neither was there the hardness she had seen when they first rode out of Dry Creek. Slowly, a fragile thread was weaving between them, spun of necessity, of survival, and of something neither dared to name. The crack in the armor on the fourth evening. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of mesquite. The sun bled red across the mesa, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into eternity. Eliza sat at the table, sewing one of Jackson's shirts, the fabric rough against her fingers. He was outside, splitting wood, the steady rhythm of the axe a heartbeat against the silence. When he finally came in, sweat dampening his collar, she dared to speak the words she had been holding back. "You could have let me go," she whispered, "back at the depot. You bought the fare. You could have sent me east and never thought of me again. Why didn't you?" He froze, standing just inside the doorway, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. For a moment she thought he would ignore her, as he had ignored so many of her questions. But then he set the hat aside, ran a hand over his face, and let out a breath that trembled with weariness. "Because I know what happens to women left behind," he said finally. "Seen too many of them turn to dust or worse. This land don't forgive weakness. It eats the alone and forgotten. I couldn't let it eat you." Her throat tightened. "And what about you? Who keeps it from eating you?" His gaze met hers, sharp and unguarded, and for the first time she saw not just the outlaw or the protector, but the man beneath, the man who carried loneliness like a second skin. He looked away, jaw tight. "Nobody, but I made my peace with that." In that moment her heart cracked in a way she hadn't expected. She realized that beneath all his strength, Jackson Hale was a man condemned to solitude, living in the shadow of death. And though she feared him, though she barely knew him, some part of her longed to step into that shadow and share the burden. The bounty on his name, their fragile peace, did not last. News traveled fast across the frontier, carried by telegraph wires, stagecoaches, and whiskey-soaked tongues in saloons. Word reached Dry Creek that Jackson Hale had killed again, and with it came the whisper of a price on his head. One evening, as the cicadas sang in the dusk, a rider came pounding up the canyon trail. Jackson met him outside, hand hovering near his revolver, while Eliza peered through the cabin window, her heart hammering. The rider was a wiry man with a scar down his cheek, his hat pulled low. He carried no warmth in his expression, only the cold hunger of a predator who had smelled blood. "Hale," the man drawled. "Heard the governor's men posted a bounty on you. $200, dead or alive. That kind of money talks loud in these parts." Jackson's voice was calm, but his stance was coiled. "You aiming to collect it?" The man spat into the dirt. "Not me. But there's others coming. Men with quicker hands and fewer scruples. They'll track you here soon enough." His eyes flicked toward the cabin, "and they won't be as polite about what they take." A chill swept over Eliza. She understood then that her presence wasn't just a burden. It was a weapon for his enemies, leveraged to break him. She was no longer simply the woman left at the depot. She was the crack in his armor, the weakness they would use against him. When the rider finally turned and disappeared into the night, Jackson lingered outside, staring into the darkness as though trying to will it back. When he came inside, his face was carved of stone. "You should leave," he said quietly. "Pack what you can. Go back east before it's too late." The words stung sharper than any insult. "And what about you?" she demanded. "I'll face what's mine to face." "Alone?" Her voice broke. "After you told me the land eats the alone?" His eyes softened then, but only for a heartbeat. "Better it eats me than you." The night of confession, that night, sleep would not come. Eliza lay staring at the ceiling, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. Leave. Return east, where a loveless life awaited, where she would always be the woman abandoned at a depot, or stay, and risk the wrath of men who saw her only as bait. At last, unable to bear the silence, she rose and crossed the room. Jackson sat by the dying fire, staring into the embers, a bottle of whiskey untouched at his side. He did not look up as she sat across from him. "Tell me," she whispered, "what did you do to earn such hatred? Why do they hunt you?" For a long time he said nothing. Then slowly he began to speak. "I rode with the Red Jack gang once," he admitted, voice hoarse. "Wasn't by choice at first. They found me half dead after a border skirmish, patched me up and gave me a gun. I rode with them 2 years, saw towns burn, saw families torn apart, and I held the match more times than I care to count. When I finally broke from them, I thought I could outrun the stain. But men don't forget. The law don't forget, and the devil sure as hell don't forget." His eyes met hers, raw with the weight of confession. "That's who you tied yourself to, Miss Harrow. A man with blood on his hands and a price on his head." Tears blurred her vision, but she did not look away. "And yet you saved me. Saving one don't erase the others." "Maybe not," she said softly, "but it matters to me." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air, and in that fragile silence something shifted. The walls between them, built of fear and shame, cracked just enough for truth to seep through. She reached across the table, laying her hand atop his. His skin was rough, scarred, trembling faintly beneath hers. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. His breath caught, and though he did not move, though his face remained guarded, she felt it. The faintest squeeze of his hand, the unspoken admission that her presence had already changed the course of his journey. The shadow on the horizon, but the West does not forgive easily. Dawn broke the next morning with the sound of distant hoofbeats, more than one, steady and relentless, echoing through the canyon. Jackson rose, his face pale with resolve. "They've found us," Eliza's heart thundered. She knew then that their fragile bond would be tested not by words, but by fire and blood. And as she clutched his coat to her chest, she swore silently that she would not abandon him, not even if the whole frontier rose against them. The hoofbeats grew louder, a relentless drumbeat echoing against the canyon walls, until even the ground beneath the cabin seemed to tremble. Eliza stood frozen by the hearth, her breath caught in her throat, clutching Jackson's coat as though it were armor. Outside, Copper snorted and pawed the earth, nervous, sensing what was coming long before the first riders appeared. Jackson was already moving, calm, efficient, almost cold in the way he strapped on his gun belt, checked his rifle, and began shuttering the windows. His movements carried the weight of routine, the certainty of a man who had seen trouble arrive too many times to be surprised by it anymore. "How many?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He paused just long enough to glance at her. "Enough." And then the riders came into view. 6 of them. Hard men in dust-stained coats, faces hidden under wide brims and bandanas. They carried rifles slung across their shoulders, revolvers gleaming at their hips. The lead man, a broad-shouldered brute with a scar curling across his jaw, spurred his horse forward until he was nearly at the porch. "Hail," he shouted, his voice carrying through the still morning air. "You've run long enough. Bounty's been doubled. $400 for your head. We're here to collect." Jackson stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, his silhouette framed against the rising sun. He stood tall, unflinching, the calm in his posture daring them to draw first. "You want my head?" he said evenly. "You'll have to earn it." A ripple of cruel laughter passed through the riders. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing as they drifted toward the cabin. "And the girl? Word in town says you picked her up at the depot. Sweet little thing. She worth more alive, or should we just take her for fun?" The blood drained from Eliza's face. Her hands shook, but she held Jackson's coat tighter, fighting the terror clawing at her chest. She could feel the weight of their stares, the vile hunger behind their words. Jackson's voice cut sharp as a blade. "You touch her, and you won't live long enough to regret it." The tension cracked like lightning. Rifles raised, spurs jingled, and in the next heartbeat the siege began. The first shot's gunfire split the air, deafening, furious. Bullets tore splinters from the cabin walls, shattered glass from the windows. Eliza dropped to the floor, covering her head, her ears ringing with every shot. Smoke stung the air, acrid and suffocating, while the horses screamed outside, panicked by the chaos. Jackson fired back, steady and measured, each shot deliberate. Through the crack of the shutter, Eliza saw one rider pitch backward from his horse, blood spraying in the morning light. Another cursed, clutching his arm, retreating behind a boulder for cover. Inside the cabin, every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, to flee into the open plains. But there was nowhere to go. The canyon walls boxed them in, and beyond those riders lay only desert and death. When the firing paused, Jackson crouched low beside her. Sweat and gunpowder streaked his face, his eyes burning with intensity. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "You keep your head down. Don't open that door unless I tell you. No matter what you hear, no matter what they say. Understand?" She nodded, though her body shook. Jackson, but before she could say more, the shooting resumed, louder, closer. He rose again, returning fire with grim precision, and she was left pressed against the floor, praying to a god she had long ago stopped believing in. The fire in her hand, showers seemed to pass in minutes. The sun rose higher, baking the canyon, while the riders circled like wolves, firing from every angle. The cabin shook under the assault, its logs scarred and smoking. At one point, Jackson staggered back from the window, blood darkening his sleeve where a bullet had grazed him. Eliza gasped, reaching for him, but he waved her off, teeth clenched against the pain. "I'm fine. Keep down." But she could not sit idle any longer. Trembling, she crawled to the shelves, found a pistol among the tools, and clutched it in both hands. The weight was heavier than she expected, the metal cold against her palms. Jackson saw her, his eyes flashing. "Eliza, no. I can help," she insisted, her voice breaking. "I won't just hide while they kill you." For a moment, anger sparked in his expression, but beneath it was something else. Fear, raw and unmasked. Not fear of death, but fear of losing her. "You fire that gun," he said hoarsely, "and you can't go back. Once you take a life, it don't leave you. Ever." Her throat tightened. She thought of the cairn by the mesa, the blood already spilled, the ghosts that haunted him. She understood the warning, understood the cost. And yet, when another bullet shattered the window inches from where he stood, she lifted the pistol with trembling hands. "Then let me carry some of it with you." The breaking point by mid-afternoon, the riders grew restless. Their leader, Scarjaw, shouted threats and curses, promising to burn the cabin, to drag Eliza out screaming. Jackson ignored him, his jaw set, his eyes hard. But Eliza could see the exhaustion in his movements, the way each reload took a heartbeat longer, the way his wounded arm trembled. Finally, silence fell. Too much silence. Jackson froze, listening. Then his eyes widened. "They're coming from the back." Before Eliza could react, the cabin door burst inward. Two men crashed inside, rifles raised, their boots stomping across the floor. Eliza screamed, lifting the pistol without thinking. The sound of her own shot deafened her, the recoil slamming her back against the wall. One of the men cried out, clutching his shoulder, collapsing to the floorboards. The other swung his rifle toward her, eyes blazing with murderous intent. And then Jackson was there faster than thought, his revolver barking once, twice. The outlaw fell dead at Eliza's feet, blood pooling across the wooden floor. The cabin reeked of gunpowder and death. Eliza's hands shook violently, the pistol clattering to the ground. She stared at what she had done, at the man writhing in pain, and her stomach twisted until she thought she might be sick. Jackson grabbed her shoulders, forcing her eyes to his. "Look at me, breathe." Tears streamed down her cheeks. "I shot him. You survived," he said firmly. "That's all. Don't carry more than that." But she knew she would carry it. The weight of it, the way the pistol had bucked in her hands, the way the man's scream still echoed in her ears. The vow in blood as dusk settled. The riders finally withdrew, dragging their wounded, leaving the canyon in uneasy silence. Two of their number lay dead, another badly injured, and though the rest had retreated, the threat lingered in the dust they left behind. Inside the cabin, Eliza bandaged Jackson's arm with trembling hands. He winced but said nothing, his gaze fixed on her face. She was pale, haunted, yet there was a fierceness in her eyes he had not seen before. "They'll be back," she whispered. He nodded. "And we'll be ready." Her hand stilled on the bandage. "Jackson, I can't go back east. Not now, not after this. If they come again, I'll stand with you, no matter what it costs." His eyes softened, the hardness melting just enough for her to glimpse the man beneath. "Eliza, you don't know what you're saying," but she did. The moment she pulled the trigger, her fate had been sealed. She was no longer the woman abandoned at the depot, no longer the helpless bride with a broken promise. She was something else now, something forged in fear and fire. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with unflinching resolve. Your journey ends with me, and mine ends with you. For the first time, his hand reached to brush her cheek, rough and hesitant, as though afraid she might vanish like smoke. The moment was brief, fragile, but it burned brighter than any fire. Outside, the canyon lay quiet, but both knew it was only the calm before another storm. The bounty would draw more men, hungrier men, and their blood-soaked vow had bound them together in a fight neither could escape. The ranch at Red Mesa did not sleep again. Though the canyon was silent, though the wind carried only the cry of coyotes, both Eliza and Jackson knew the quiet was a mask. The bounty would spread farther with each day, carried by riders to saloons, telegraph wires, and outlaw camps. Men would come not in sixes but in dozens, all eager to claim $400 in the legend of killing Jackson Hale. By the third night, Jackson had made his decision. He rose before dawn, his movements heavy with resignation, and began saddling Copper. Eliza stirred from restless dreams, eyes swollen from lack of rest, and watched him without speaking. We can't stay, he said at last, his voice low, his back to her. They'll burn this place to ash and take everything we've got left. If we ride now, we've got a chance. Out there in the desert, maybe we lose them. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket to her chest. Lose them, or die trying. He looked at her then, eyes shadowed, jaw tight. Death's better than being hunted in your own home. I won't wait for them to come knocking again. The words stung, but she understood. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a target, a coffin waiting to be nailed shut. So she rose, packed her few belongings, her worn dress, a Bible her mother had pressed into her hands years ago, the pistol that had already marked her soul with one shot. And by sunrise she was astride Copper, clinging to Jackson as they rode away from the only shelter she had known since stepping off the train. The wilderness beyond Red Mesa, the desert stretched endless before them, a sea of dust and stone that shimmered under the rising sun. Mesas rose like fortresses from the earth, their cliffs glowing crimson in the morning light. Dry riverbeds cut through the land like scars, and the horizon blurred with heat even before midday. They rode in silence, the hooves of Copper pounding a steady rhythm against the hard ground. Eliza clung to Jackson's back, every jolt of the saddle reminding her how far she was from the cobblestone streets of the East, from the safety of towns where law was more than a man with a gun. The land was harsh, unforgiving, yet strangely beautiful. Vultures circled overhead. Prickly pear and mesquite clawed at the edges of the trail. Once in the distance she glimpsed a herd of wild mustangs cresting a ridge, their manes tossing like banners in the wind. Jackson guided Copper with quiet skill, his eyes always scanning the ridges, the shadows, every flicker of movement. He said little, but she could feel the tension in him, the coil of a man who knew danger stalked them with every step. When the sun reached its zenith, they found shade beneath a rocky outcrop. Jackson watered Copper sparingly, then offered Eliza a tin cup with the smallest sip left for herself. We'll need to ration, he said. 3 days if we're careful. She swallowed the warm metallic water, feeling it burn her parched throat. And after that? After that, we find a river. Or we don't. His bluntness chilled her, but she recognized it for what it was. Truth. Out here, lies would kill faster than bullets. The closeness of survival. That night they camped in a narrow canyon, the walls rising high and jagged, the stars sharp as blades overhead. The air was cold, the desert shedding its heat with cruel swiftness. Eliza shivered beneath her thin blanket until Jackson wordlessly pulled her closer, wrapping his coat around them both. At first she stiffened, her breath caught, unsure of the line she was crossing, but the steady thrum of his heartbeat against her ear, the solid wall of his chest beneath her cheek, the faint scent of leather and smoke, it all eased the storm in her. You should have left me at the depot, she murmured, half dreaming, half afraid. His hand shifted slightly, resting at her back, holding her as though he feared she might vanish. I tried, he said softly. God help me, I tried. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of him chase away the cold. In that fragile moment, the world felt narrowed to just the two of them. Two souls bound by accident, by danger, by something that felt dangerously close to love. The ambush in the ravine. By the second day, exhaustion gnawed at them both. The land seemed endless, the sun merciless. But worse still were the hoof prints they found etched in the dust behind them. The bounty hunters had not lost the trail. As they wound through a ravine, the silence broke with a rifle crack. The shot rang off the rocks and Copper reared, nearly throwing them both. Eliza screamed, clutching Jackson while bullets sparked against the canyon walls. "Down!" Jackson roared, yanking her from the saddle. They tumbled behind a boulder just as more shots split the air. Dirt sprang around them. Copper bolted down the trail carrying their supplies. "They'll cut us off," Eliza gasped, panic clawing at her throat. Jackson loaded his rifle, teeth clenched. "Not if I cut them first." He leaned out, firing into the shadows where the flashes came. A man cried out, tumbling from the ridge, his body striking the rocks below. Another returned fire, pinning them down. The echo thunderous in the narrow ravine. Eliza pressed against the stone, her hands shaking. She still carried the pistol from the cabin, its weight heavy in her skirts. Her mind screamed to stay hidden, to leave the killing to him. But then she saw the glint of steel above, the shape of a man aiming down at Jackson's back. Without thinking, she raised the pistol and fired. The recoil tore through her arms, her ears ringing with the blast. But she saw the man topple, his rifle clattering against the rocks. Jackson turned, eyes blazing with a mix of shock and fury. But before he could speak, the last of their attackers fled, disappearing into the desert, leaving silence once more. The pistol slipped from her trembling hands. I had to." Jackson seized her wrist, his grip firm, his voice raw. "You saved my life." "And damned myself again," she whispered. His gaze softened, but his voice was steady. "No, you saved me, and that's the only truth that matters." The vow beneath the stars that night, they found Copper grazing not far from the ravine, their supplies mostly intact. They built a small fire in the shelter of a cliff, though both knew it could draw eyes. Eliza sat close to the flames, staring at her hands as though she could scrub the stain of gunpowder and blood from her skin. Jackson watched her in silence, his face carved by firelight, until finally he reached out, taking her hand in his. "You carry too much," he said quietly. "The West don't give second chances, but it gave us each other. Hold on to that." She looked up, tears brimming, her heart torn between grief and something achingly tender. "Jackson, what if we don't survive this?" He squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles with a gentleness that surprised her. "Then at least we'll go down together. But while we're breathing, we fight. For every mile, every sunrise, every damn heartbeat." She leaned against him then, letting her head rest on his shoulder, and for the first time she did not feel abandoned, or powerless, or broken. She felt chosen. The desert stretched vast and merciless around them, but within the circle of firelight, a vow had been forged, silent, unbreakable, and bound in blood. The desert gave way to plains at last, though by then both Eliza and Jackson were worn thin by hunger, thirst, and the relentless press of fear. Copper's flanks were lathered with sweat, his gait slower, his head hanging low. The sun rose each morning like a hammer, beating down until even the air seemed heavy enough to crush their lungs. Still they pressed forward. Every ridge, every shadowed canyon, every distant dust plume carried the threat of pursuit. And then, on the fifth morning, the threat became truth. They saw the riders cresting the horizon, 10 men armed and hard-eyed, their silhouettes black against the red dawn. The bounty had drawn them together, greed sharpening their resolve. This was no scattered band of drifters now. This was a pack, unified by hunger for gold and blood. Jackson pulled Copper to a halt on a rise overlooking the valley. His eyes narrowed, scanning the land. There would be no outrunning this. No canyon deep enough, no desert wide enough to lose them. "This is it," he said, voice flat, steady. Eliza's breath caught, her stomach twisting. "Then we fight?" He looked at her, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw regret flicker in his eyes. But then he nodded. "We fight. Together." The stand at Hollow Creek, they rode to Hollow Creek, a narrow gorge where a trickle of water carved its way between jagged cliffs. It was no fortress, but it offered cover and choke points enough to give them a chance. Jackson dismounted, tethered Copper in the shade, and began setting the ground with grim precision. He stacked rocks for barricades, checked his ammunition, and handed Eliza a spare rifle. Her hands shook as she took it, the memory of past shots burning in her bones. But when she met his gaze, she saw no doubt there, only trust. The riders came fast, their laughter carrying across the dry air. Scarjaw rode at their head, his scar twisting into a cruel grin. "Hail!" he shouted, his voice echoing against the cliffs. "$400 says you're mine." Hand over the girl and maybe I'll let you die quick. Jackson stood tall behind the barricade, rifle steady. You'll get nothing but lead. The first volley of gunfire roared, bullets sparking off stone, dust rising in choking clouds. Eliza ducked, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might split her chest. Jackson fired back with deadly precision, dropping a rider from his horse. The canyon filled with the chaos of battle, screams, gunfire, the metallic tang of blood in the air. Eliza's reckoning time blurred into noise and smoke. Eliza's hands trembled on the rifle, her ears ringing with every shot, and then she saw one of the riders break off, circling low along the creek bed, slipping behind the rocks, his eyes fixed on Jackson's exposed flank. Before she could think, she raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel, and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked like thunder and the man tumbled into the creek, his rifle clattering uselessly beside him. Her whole body shook, bile rising in her throat. But she did not look away this time. She had crossed the line before, and she knew the only way forward was to accept it. She had not chosen this life, but it had chosen her, and she would not let it take Jackson from her. Jackson glanced at her, a flicker of pride breaking through the storm of his expression. "Good girl," he murmured, before turning back to fire again. The fall of Scarjaw, the battle raged on, men falling one by one, the canyon floor stained with their blood. At last only Scarjaw remained, his face twisted with fury, his revolver smoking in his hand. He charged, spurring his horse straight into the gorge, bullets sparking around him as he roared Jackson's name. Jackson rose, rifle ready, but his wounded arm faltered, the shot going wide. Scarjaw laughed, raising his gun, and then Eliza stepped from behind the barricade, pistol in hand, her voice raw but steady. "No." The shot she fired was clean, true, and final. Scarjaw reeled in the saddle, his eyes wide with shock before he toppled into the dust. Silence fell, broken only by the rush of the creek. Eliza's knees buckled, the pistol slipping from her hands. Jackson caught her, his arm steady, his breath ragged against her hair. "It's over," he whispered. "You did it." But she shook her head, tears streaking her face. "We did it." The dawn after blood, when the sun rose the next morning, the canyon lay quiet, the bodies of the bounty hunters already claimed by vultures circling above. Eliza and Jackson stood together by the creek, their clothes torn, their skin streaked with dust and blood, but alive. Jackson looked at her, his expression unreadable, then spoke with a weight that seemed to lift years from his shoulders. "I've run my whole life. From the law, from the men I wronged, from myself. But you—" His voice broke and he reached to touch her cheek, rough fingers trembling. "You're the first thing I've ever stopped running for." Her heart ached, full to breaking. "And you're the first man who ever stood for me. Not because of a promise, not because of a letter, but because you chose to." He pulled her close then, pressing his forehead to hers, and for the first time the silence between them was not heavy, but sacred, a vow sealed not by words but by survival, by fire and blood, by the truth that their journeys had ended together here, in the wild heart of the West. Epilogue. The depot remembered weeks later. When they finally rode into Dry Creek again, the townsfolk watched with wide eyes. The whispers began at once, Jackson Hale still breathing, the depot girl alive beside him. Eliza dismounted, her chin high, her hand still clasped in Jackson's. She no longer carried the look of a woman abandoned. She carried the steel of the West in her gaze, the fire of someone who had walked through death and returned unbroken. And when the train whistle blew in the distance, echoing across the plains, she smiled faintly. The depot had once been her ruin. Now it was nothing but a memory, a place where her old life had ended so her true one could begin. She turned to Jackson, his hat shadowing his eyes but not the faint, almost disbelieving curve of his lips. "Your journey ends with me," she whispered again, the words no longer a question but a promise, and this time he did not argue.